Yeah, I would like to thank you first for inviting me, for making this possible, to the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, of course, to ASSAF, and everybody who was mentioned who was working to make this possible. I'm impressed. There's so many people happy that you could come, and I'm happy to be here. It's my first time in Israel, so it's very exciting for me. I would like to make a presentation about I will present some theses which we developed in a research project in Frankfurt, which we are doing about the transformation of domination, transformation of the state, and we are doing this in the field of migration control policy. Our point of departure is a theoretical one, or more precisely, we are departing from a materialist state theory, and we are investigating in the field of migration control policy because this was or is one of the main characteristics of the national state, the control over people and the control over territory. So I would like to make the presentations in three parts. First of all, I would give a very short and brief summary about migration in Europe and state reactions on migration, so that we know what we are talking about. And in the second part, I would like to focus on a new European agency, a border control agency. The name is Frontex, which is quite new, and that's the reason why it's interesting for us. We have to keep in mind that Frontex is maybe not the most important institution in this field. We have a range of a big number of institutions and apparatus and police, even military, which are operating in this field, and Frontex is just one of these organizations. But Frontex is especially interesting because it's a European institution. It's new, and maybe it is. I can show something which how domination and migration control policy is changing in the last 10 years. The third part, I will just give some ideas, some interpretations, what are the consequences of these processes, what have we, how can we discuss that, and there maybe the state theoretical point of view is coming back, asking for what does this mean for democracy, what does it mean for social cohesion, or what is the challenge for the society. But just some ideas which we can later discuss. Okay, starting with the first part. Since the 1970s, a deep transformation affecting the relation between state, people and nation, and hence the constitution of modern statehood can be observed within international political economy. The fundamental restructuring of international political economy brought about an alteration also in the field of migration control. In this aspect, or migration management, in this respect, so-called high qualified workers are increasingly recruited by metropolitan states, and on the one side and at the other side we can see that the demand for cheap labor creates jobs for irregular or illegalized migration. The key term, or the neoliberal key term of this transformation is managing migration. This is the key term of this migration policy, maybe of the last 10 years. The increase in migration is one of the main features of transnationalization. It's not so much the number of migrants due to the growth of world population. The percentage is not really higher than in the mid-60s of migration, but it's rather the global dimension and the new forms also of communication, so that it's possible to speak of a new age of migration, maybe also especially for Europe. For Western Europe, this is quite a new development, which started with the crisis of Fordism, end of the 70s. And in the meantime, the percentage of migrants in Europe an estimated 22 million people is not unlike that of classical migration countries such as the United States of America, Australia or Canada. Approximately 15% of these migrants are without valid residence status and therefore illegalized or irregular. Maybe we can discuss the term later. Countless other transit migrants have to hold out at the border on their way to Europe for years. They either gain the money for an illegalized crossing of the border in the shadow economy of peripheral border areas or stay in one of the countless camps along the Mediterranean coastline. The European inside-outside relation is produced as a regulative of the North-South relation. I mean, if we ask why do we have borders, I mean, this is a question which nobody is asking for, but borders is nothing natural. So I think there are many reasons why we have borders, but one of the reasons is that there is a regulation of a global division of labor and regulation of North-South relations. This is maybe one of the main points of the question, why do we have borders, to defend a special way of life in the heart of the question, I mean. The main effect of migration control policy is therefore not covered by the foreclosure of the term Fortress Europe. Europe, which was a very important term some years ago to blame the policy of Europe. But it covers not the productivity of this or the new dimension of this migration policy. The productivity of the migration regime is to be found much more in the flexible detachment of labor from the place of production, recourses and rights. Rather than foreclosure, this perspective centers the deprivation of rights factor as the main operating mode of the migration regime. The population contained in the EU territory is assembled in a stratified manner according to rights outlined in the EU border regime. The legal categories range from strong rights to complete exclusion from the legal form. Citizens of one of the EU member states have the strongest position, since we have a European citizenship in the Treaty of Maastricht 1992, and since the European Court of Justice developed this citizenship and added social rights. So people who had the members are citizens of one European state, they have even social rights in another European state. A second category can be taken as the mentioned high-skilled or so-called high-skilled workers with documents. We have a new regulation, a blue card regulation, to attract these high-skilled workers and who obviously have much more rights than other migrants. The third category in our project is the people who seek for asylum or who have asylum, and they have also less rights. For example, it depends a bit on the member state. In Germany, they have restricted mobility rights. They have to stay in a special region, for example. And the fourth category, of course, would be the illegalized, the irregular migrants, which are living in Europe without political participation, without the possibility without juridical protection. The rupture emerged between the metropolitan, legally protected way of life and the approximately 22 million so-called third country nationals. Thus, the EU border basically divides the population into two main groups. The targets of the migration control policy are transnational migrants galvanized by global restructuring processes in the peripheral countries. Only a small number manage to gain a precarious resident status as refugees or legal migrants. Because of the rupture running between the global north and the south, Etienne Balibar, a French philosopher, thinks it fits to speak of a global apartheid regime that assumes a specific shape in Europe. This situation leads to a disaggregation of citizenship, to quote Sheila Ben-Habib, or to zones of differentiated citizenship, as Ivar Ong calls them. These zones are subject to variable regulative forms and techniques of ruling. Most of all, however, they are generated stratified rights. The European border regime has developed into a complex web of linked up biopolitical databases mapping the population, refugee return agreements with members of African and Asian states, and common border controls. The border of the Mediterranean Sea have turned into one of particular interest, even if the most of the migrants don't enter by the sea, but we have a special situation, or a dramatic situation there. The most of the migrants enter legally and are so-called, in the EU talk, overstayers. They stay for a longer time and then they are irregular or illegalized. But I think we have a special situation in the sea which is quite dramatic. When the German Minister of the Interior was asked if Germany was defended against illegal migration in Lampedusa, this little famous island in Italy, or Lanzarote, which is part of the Canary Islands, he responded, quotation, "Of course, in a Europe without internal border controls, the border of every member state are monitored at the common external border," end of quotation. One component of this is a widely branching system of camps. It includes camps in war zones financed indirectly by the EU through international organizations which are meant to make refugee movements controllable as early as possible on a large scale, as well as territorial camps in and around Europe. These camps are widely removed from the public view. It was, for example, for a long time not possible for the UN Refugee Agency to visit the above-mentioned camp in Lampedusa, and before the arrival of a EU Parliament delegation, the inmates were flown out in 2004. These camps can also be found in Europe towns under the name of detention centers. From an inner circle, and these camps form an inner circle of including exclusion. A second circle is established in neighboring countries, which, in line with the European neighborhood policy, the EU membership negotiations, bilateral agreements, and economic aid, are also pushed into building camps and sealing off their borders, turning them into a buffer zone. Those migrants who cannot afford to travel overland or the documents necessary for a flight decide to take the maritime route via the Canary Islands, the Strait of Gibraltar, Sicily, Malta, or Cyprus, or the Aegean. The European member states, as well as the European Union, responded with a quasi-military border control approach. The Mediterranean Sea has virtually turned into a military high security zone in the past decades. Various border patrol and military unions from different nation states, but also from the NATO in its war against international terrorism, patrol the waterways between African countries and Europe from sea and air. An investigation carried out for the European Parliament in 2007 concluded that the number of people who died since the implementation of these controls had with 8,855 fatalities gone up significantly. Moreover, the means of control have not reduced the number of illegalized migrants, but made them choose other, more dangerous routes. For example, I mentioned that the people tried to cross the Strait of Gibraltar. This is not possible yet because this part is so observed that it's impossible to pass. That they have to choose longer ways to cross to the coast of Almeria or Granada, and they have to cross almost 200 kilometers the Mediterranean Sea. I mean, nobody really exactly knows how many people died in this process. Also in the Canary Islands, where the boats have to go to the sea, more to the high sea, to have the possibility to get to come to the Canary Islands. Since 2005, the border control has reached a new dimension with the attempt to put control under European sovereignty by establishing the European Border Control Agency, Frontex. Its authority includes the EU member states, Switzerland, and the countries associated to the Schengen Agreement. It was based on a regulation in the year 2004. Its duties include the protection of external borders and the support of member states in the education of their border police, as well as risk analysis. The agency commenced operation in October 2005. The failure of the initial attempt to install a genuine European border guard pursued by some member states and the European Commission, Frontex now functions as a vertical loose coupling which at the first view is not compromising the member states' sovereignty. It works within a weakly formalized environment in which administrative elites pursue their own interests and policy goals in parts without having to fear intervention from parliaments and courts. This kind of experimentalist governance contributes to policy outcomes and trust building in highly contested areas, but it may at the same time challenge established patterns of accountability. What is, however, striking is that Frontex has been founded as a further addition to the vast array of European agencies. These were not envisaged by the EU founding treaties, but are only created by dint of secondary legislation. Thus, they are autonomous administrative units with a very vague legal basis. While the agencies of the 70s, the European agencies of the 70s and 80s had no sovereign decision-making powers, this has changed in the 90s. All in all, the spin-off of agency leads to a spin-off of administrative apparatuses and consequently means an increasing independence of these agencies from political influence of the Council and the Commission and parliamentary contribution. The new agency, at least the agency concerning internal security and border patrol, have grown out of their mere technical regulatory garment. For Frontex, this implies that the agency is not only supposed to work together with Europol. Europol is another agency which tries to coordinate European member state police. It also commissions extensive feasibility studies for more effective border patrol and carries out operations itself. Since 2006, several joint operations along the African coast in the Mediterranean were taking place. Meanwhile, in 2007, we have had, or we could observe amendment of the regulation of Frontex, and there was the formation of the so-called Rapid Border Intervention Teams, so-called RABITs. They involve border police forces from EU member states which are available for common border patrol operations on the request of states in urgent or exceptional circumstances. In these operations, executive authority is transferred to the RABITs by the host member state of the operation. The regulation lends intervention power to all forces deployed in these joint Frontex operations. So that's a bit what Frontex is doing and how it is organized. I would try to give some talks about some of the consequences of this process. The questionable legal foundation for this border control unit, the unclear competence and the status structure of the officers operating in the external borders, the opaque and limited possibility to claim legal protection, as well as the tendency to exterritorialize means of control in order to get rid of human rights obligations, lead to a structural, constitutional and democratical shortfall. Frontex highlights the consequences of population regulation within the extended European state apparatus ensemble. The multiplication of governmental control apparatus and the reorganization of the knowledge-power relation is about to take place at the European scale. The European-wide network of former national control apparatus and the formation of new apparatus do not only serve to extensively monitor the external border. In fact, the expansion of interagency information exchange and the establishment of new information gathering programs or agency continuously enlarge the knowledge about the population also within Europe, a characteristic, by the way, of the development of the nation state since the 18th century in terms of demographical and statistical data collection. One result of these processes are specific technology or new technologies of power which lead to a further detachment of also the included population from the decision centers. This in turn tends to result in an undermining of the control of these apparatuses. A permanent shift of power and authority in the European extended ensemble of state apparatus can be observed. Decision-making processes become much more opaque. So-called forum shifting and scale jumping leads initiatives to control the controllers or to increase involvement in political decision-making to go nowhere. Scale shifting and or scale jumping and forum shifting tries to understand how these European ensemble of state apparatus with all the national apparatus and the European institutions work in the sense of scale jumping means if they try to do something to establish new control mechanisms, for example, and they have resistance on the national base, for example, so they try it on the European base or the other way around, so to let these initiatives go to nowhere. Nevertheless, the official task of joint operations, national officials as well as Frontex are subject to a narrow network of international and European legal standards, in particular the principle of non-refoulement in the Geneva Refugee Convention, the International Pact on Civil and Political Rights, the Anti-Torture Convention, as well as the European Human Rights Convention regarding the interpretation of the European Court of Human Rights. The deportation of refugees to areas in which they are persecuted, exposed to torture, inhuman treatment or other serious human rights violations is prohibited. Moreover, this implies access to the legal proceedings reviewing the refugee status on a case-by-case study. And what is interesting is just a week ago we had a decision of the European Court of Human Rights which clarified the situation. That is clearly that the intention of the member states and police to exterritorialize the rights, in the sense that they say outside of the 12-mile zone, all these rights which we are talking about do not apply. Now we know we have official interpretation and a judgment which they all this is wrong. All this which was done there is illegal. So we don't know what will happen now. I mean, it's an important step. But anyway, it's really difficult to control what they are doing in the high sea. So maybe we have to think about how to observe that. But Italy, for instance, said they will, or Monti said that they will change their practices. They had, for instance, a lot of joint patrols with Libya. I mean, Libya before the revolution. So. And there were a lot of camps financed by Italy and even with European money. So we have to look if this can or will change. In respect to the transformation of the state, we can say not only the national control apparatus in Europe were extended for the combat and illegalization of migrants, but new European institutions emerged as well. These new apparatus form in parts outside the legal and democratic control. The European Parliament is, for instance, completely left out of the ex ante and ex post process of Frontex joint operations. The latter is exemplary for various reasons. First of all, it is a new stage of apparatus that defies democratic control or in part democratic control and juridical accountability. Second, this apparatus fulfills an important function by constructing an outside of the European Union and to reproduce the global division of labor. I mean, the most important is we can see with the example of Frontex that the research of democracy and law is always contested, and that we have to defend or to conquer democratic rights and control of these apparatuses. So I hope I'm in time, I don't know. Okay. Thank you.